up, but just wanted to address everyone. Once again, welcome. I know you've all been individually welcomed as you walked in, but as a group, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this Fireside chat. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Richard Fiella. I'm Senior Vice President with Caldwell, and I head up the sales and corporate development teams at Caldwell. And it is my privilege today to introduce you to our firm's founder and chairman, Mr. Tom Caldwell, who's going to be acting as the moderator today for our event. Tom has been repeatedly recognized over his 50-plus year career for significant contributions made both to the Canadian investment industry as well as the social welfare of our country. He is a member of the Order of Canada and the Investment Industry Hall of Fame. So with that, Mr. Caldwell, will you please come up to the podium here and introduce our special guest speaker and start what promises to be a very thought-provoking session. Thank you very much, Mr. Caldwell.
Well, you know, it's a privilege. Conrad Black, Lord Black, is a great Canadian. He's a member of the House of Lords, an accomplished author, a very successful businessman, built a press empire, historian. One of the things I was thinking the other day, on the weekends, I buy the Globe and Mail, just to check the obituaries to see who my competitors I beat. And I buy the Post to read Lord Black's column. The thing I admire about Conrad Black the most is he's managed to cram about 5 lifetimes into one. Amazing, just an amazing life. And with that comes perspective, compassion, and wisdom. Conrad, come on up and join us.
Well, let me start by thanking you for your unrecognizably gracious introduction. If you hadn't concluded it with my name, I wouldn't have been sure who was coming up here. But I accept a draft. Thank you very much.
Conrad's going to start with a few comments of what he thinks is kind of relevant, and then we'll just sort of bounce some ideas back and forth. And then after a while, when we both run dry, we'll ask you guys for a few questions. So, Conrad, first off, the floor is yours. Carry on, as you were.
What I'll do, if I may, is just say a few words about the current political situation in the United States and in Canada. And I do it with some trepidation because these are matters as well known to all of you as to me, but perhaps I can formulate them in a slightly different way. In the case of the United States, I think the current unprecedented state of divisiveness and disorder in that country, unprecedented at least since the Civil War, is traceable to the coincidence of several factors at the same time. With the end of the Cold War, it ended 60 years where the United States had a mobilization of public opinion against a danger, whether it was the Depression, World War II, or the Cold War. And at the end of that, the country became, as people do when tension passes, somewhat complacent and then gave way to a level of self-criticism that it has become absurdly exaggerated. And we all remember that the United States, since it was founded, not as countries were at the time of the American Revolution, as a distinct cultural entity, where the French spoke French, and the Dutch spoke Dutch, and the Swedes spoke Swedish, and so on. They were only the second English-speaking country, so they became the universal land of liberty. Now, it's a mythos, and it took a number of liberties with the truth, but it worked. And at the end of the Cold War, there became this re-examination of the origins of the U.S. that has been hypercritical and unjustly critical. At the same time, we had, after the revolution and the status of the African Americans, following in what Mr. Lincoln called the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil and 100 years of segregation, the United States has made a greater effort than any country in history to raise a formerly subjugated and servile group to a position of absolute equality. And yet, unfortunately, obviously, there's still some elements that lag. And in this atmosphere, the joy of liberation and self-help for the African Americans has also left a group behind that are extremely embittered. And in a country where it is a constitutional right to bear arms, and there are 400 million guns, that leads to an unfortunate level of violence. And third is this Trump phenomenon. For some reason that I have no idea what the answer to it is, he appears to have been virtually the only person who recognized the growing level of discontent in that country. And there was, in the post-Reagan years, a kind of bipartisan consensus. It was only the second time in American history you had 3 consecutive 2-term presidents. And there was a bipartisan consensus that worked very well for the upper half of the country in income terms. But as Trump detected, it did not work well for the lower half. The per capita average the per capita average growth of income per capita, I'm sorry to be so awkward in formulating that, the per capita income growth for individuals in the U.S., let me remember it, yes, was approximately 4.5% in the last 6 years of Reagan, 3% in the Clinton years, slightly over 2% under George W. Bush, and 1% with Obama. And that trend is obvious, and it meant for the 10 years prior to the 2016 election, the average American hadn't had an increase in disposable income at all, and in many cases the reverse. And from the standpoint of these people, scores of millions of people, things were very good for the yuppies and very good for the rich friends of the bipartisan establishment in Wall Street and Hollywood and Silicon Valley. But they were consigned to the group disparaged by then candidate Obama as being too reliant on guns and religion, and dismissed by candidate Clinton as a basket of deplorables. Not a wise inference to deliver about approximately half of the electorate. And it was in those circumstances that Trump came to office. And of course, he's now, I suppose, the most famous person in the world, and there's not much more to be said about him. But I would just point out a couple of things, if I might. Indicative of the problem that he was campaigning against was that in the 32 years from 1981 to 2013, 8 straight terms, one member or other of the Bush or Clinton families was either the president, the vice president, or the secretary of state. 32 years in a row, they were just passing these great offices back and forth. And Trump ran against that, and it was a very telling point that he made. And he would also, I would say, I put this to you, he achieved, I mean, despite all of the garishness and all of the unutterable hucksterism and the nonsense, you know, the 96,000 people in the Pontiac Silverdome watching him shave Vince McMahon's hair off. You know, he compensated him by making his wife the small business administrator. But just nonsense like that. Despite all of that, he accomplished more before he was president than anyone who preceded him in that office, except those who made an important contribution to the founding of the country and its institutions, be Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, and those who led victoriously great armies in great wars, be Grant and Eisenhower. You could also make a case for Herbert Hoover because of his war relief after World War I and the great engineering firm he built up worldwide. But that's all. Trump is an extraordinarily accomplished man, and his 2 great strokes of genius, politically speaking, were that he did translate celebrity into the highest elective office. And he pulled very carefully, and he obviously put questions that others didn't. And he changed party affiliation 7 times in 13 years. He was like a big African cat trying to get the right wildebeest, you see. And then he saw his moment and he struck. And the establishment that he overturned reacted so violently that we have this terribly dangerous situation of the evident corruption of the senior intelligence agencies and parts of the Justice Department in an effort to destroy a political opponent. And this is extremely dangerous to the constitutional system of the United States. And the fact is, I think most people agree that in policy terms, he was a very capable and clear-thinking president and accomplished a great deal. There is a legitimate question about his stylistic infelicities, but he does have a huge following. So I would just conclude on the U.S. by saying this, that because the powers that be in the Democratic Party are so convinced that they can defeat Trump, they have taken the necessary steps to ensure his renomination. Because by indicting him in completely spurious counts as they have, and it's likely there'll be some more, they've effectively forced the Republican Party to rally behind him, but that's probably what they would have done anyway. I think that the Democratic confidence that they can defeat him is misplaced. They only did it the last time by relying on millions of harvested ballots that could not be verified in an election where 50,000 votes flipped in 3 states would have given Trump the victory in the Electoral College. And they only did it with a candidate they could hide in the basement on medical grounds, I mean public medical grounds. And they had 95% of the national political media and 100% of the social media, led by Twitter, behind them, and outspent Trump 2-1. They're not going to have all of those conditions again, and they will have to carry the can for the most incompetent administration since before the Civil War. But that is now coming down to a test between which group is more numerous. Either those who don't particularly like Trump but will hold their noses and vote for him because they are so appalled at the implications of using the justice system to sandbag an opposing candidate, or those who are so appalled at the prospect of Trump coming back that they will overlook this improper use of the justice system. My suspicion is it is the constitutionalists who will win, because I think Trump has raised his game, and I think, as he indicated in his speech the night after, or the night of the day that he was indicted, or arraigned, I should say, that he's moderated the bombast of earlier years. But who knows? That's my guess. As for Canada, as you would all know, we had a correct, fully functioning bipartisan system until World War I. I believe in the first, I think I'm right in this, in the first 12 elections held in this country after Confederation, 10 of them were won by John A. Macdonald or Wilfrid Laurier, and the parties were relatively evenly divided. And in 1917, when the Prime Minister Borden yielded to the demand in English Canada for the imposition of conscription, which was essentially just conscripting the French Canadians because the volunteer levels were so high amongst the others, Laurier warned him that if he just did it by a parliamentary vote, he, Laurier, would lose the leadership of French Canada to Bourassa, Henri Bourassa, and Quebec would be waiting to secede. But if he had either an election or a referendum, he would win it, but there would be enough of democracy that Laurier could maintain the leadership of French Canadians. But he didn't say to Borden, but he did say to his subalterns, Ernest Lapointe and Mackenzie King, he'll win the election all right, but the Conservatives won't win another election in this country for 40 years. And that's basically what happened. Because apart from R.B. Bennett's one term, 1930, where he was running against the Great Depression, the customs scandal, and the Beauharnois scandal, the Liberals were in office thereafter. From 1921, the next election, until the arrival of Brian Mulroney in 1984, 63 years. The Liberals governed for 52 years. We had essentially a 1.5 party system, and the Conservatives were just groups that didn't happen to be Liberals. And an uneasy coalition between Bay Street finance and prairie populism, Mr. Diefenbaker, that sort of thing. And so they didn't get in office very much. But every 4 or 5 elections, the public would think, well, look, we have to let the other side come to bat, and they would, but they wouldn't stay there long. And I think that is changing. Brian Mulroney changed it to some extent. Excuse me. Because he cracked the Liberal stranglehold on Quebec. He is a Quebecer. He speaks perfect French, and he knows the province in a way that John Turner didn't. But as you all remember, in trying to keep the non-liberals, who are mainly nationalists in Quebec, and the nationalists in Quebec aren't really federalists. So in trying to keep them on side, he alienated the West, and the Reform Party took his Western support. And then when he was, in my opinion, improperly denied the passage of Meech Lake and Charlottetown, although I didn't particularly like the agreements, I thought he was entitled to have them ratified. When that happened, he lost Quebec as well to the Nationalists. And that's when the Conservatives came down to 2 MPs, if you recall. And things have been rebuilt, but his contribution to breaking the Liberal stranglehold on the country was that the Bloc Québécois, and of course it's logically outrageous to have a separatist party in a federal election, but they're there anyway. They and the NDP have made it a 4-party race in Quebec, and the Liberals can't take that province en bloc the way they used to. For Sir Wilfrid and for Mr. Lapointe when he was the associate prime minister with Mr. King, for Mr. Saint-Laurent and for Pierre Trudeau, Quebec delivered virtually everything to the Liberal Party in every federal election except, with those leaders in all of them. I recall in 1972, I was one of the people who persuaded Claude Wagner to come back into politics. Mr. Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, took 73 districts out of 75 in Quebec, and in the following election, 74 districts. And as long as that was going on, they were going to win almost all the time. Now, that's not there anymore for them. But the key is, Pierre Poilievre is a different type of conservative leader. He is, I believe, the first conservative leader in the lifetimes of probably any of us in this room. And I suspect, Tom, you and I may be among the senior people here.
I got you beat on that one.
That is a genuine conservative. When you got right down to it, Mr. Diefenbaker and Robert Stanfield and Joe Clark and Aaron O'Toole were ideologically indistinguishable from the Liberals, but they said, well, we'll do pretty much the same, but we'll do it better. And in general, if voters want liberals, they want real liberals and not pretend liberals, so there's no reason to vote for them. Now, Mr. Diefenbaker was different because the Liberals had been in for 22 years, and he was a very formidable opposition leader and campaigner. To be fair, Andrew Scheer was an authentic conservative, but he didn't really try and defend his views. Pierre is a conservative. He's not especially a social conservative. He's a fiscal conservative, and he is a student of Thatcher and Reagan, and he knows that to restore a 2-party system instead of the 1.5 party system we have now, or 1 and 2 separate quarters parties, you have to sell conservatism as an alternative to liberalism. He is prepared for the inevitable avalanche of Liberal and NDP Billingsgate directed against him, amplified by most of the media, that he's harsh and cruel and uncaring and advocates ending legal abortions and so it's all nonsense. Nonsense. He isn't. He will make the point that all he is doing is advocating greater freedom for every individual, greater freedom to enjoy their own income, more of their own income, and deploy that income as they choose, and reduce the process of taking money from people who've earned it and giving it to people who've not earned it, more or less irrespective of merit. And he's going to fight that campaign, and he's going to be extremely effective at it. And he will make the point that those who are generally needful will lose nothing, not a cent of benefit will they lose. And I think that coupled with a reluctance of the country to give 4 straight terms to a very mediocre government, a government that's basically all style and no substance, and not a style that many of us find particularly alluring anyway, and whose policy prescriptions essentially, as far as I can detect, consist of an absurd overemphasis of gender issues, absolute hysteria on climate issues, a relentless truckling to the native victimhood industry without, as far as I can see, doing anything to actually help the native people, who I think we all agree have legitimate grievances, but they're not being addressed in the right way. It won't do to falsely accuse our ancestors of being genocidists, which none of them was or aspired to be, and tolerating the assimilation of the founder of this country, John A. Macdonald, to Hitler. I mean, that isn't helping the natives. And I think that it's all wearing thin. I've spoken too long, and I subside now. Those are my...
Well, you made my job easy. Well, let's go back, start with Trump again, and work our way back through that. You know, I think that's the thing we see a lot of in television, this factionalism in the States. And I think where President Trump might have missed the boat a bit, he didn't see himself as part of a movement, a counterculture. He didn't see himself as the flag bearer. He took it personally. It was about him. Now, I understand his defensiveness because he was attacked the day he even walked into the public forum, and they never stopped. I mean, I know what it's like to be beaten up a little bit in the press, and we probably sense it a little bit too. It's pretty tough stuff. And how he could put up with this for 4 years, but he did take it too personally and didn't deal with the macro issues, and it made it about him as opposed to the movement that he represented. What do you think of that?
Look, I don't want to put on the airs of being any intimate of his, but I've known him a long time, and he does call me occasionally. I don't think that's quite fair, Tom. He even calls his group a movement. And in his early days campaigning, when everyone was laughing at him and saying, this is going to be hilarious, you know, this is going to be the greatest flame out of the biggest ego in the country. And that was what the commentariat was saying, almost without exception. Newt Gingrich was the only person I knew of, and Ann Coulter, those two, who you see on television sometimes, who said, look, I don't underestimate this guy. He's got quite a wide appeal. And he always, you see, he does actually, despite being a very wealthy man, relate to the average worker. And that goes back to his days where in summer jobs, he worked on his father's construction sites. Yeah. And he sort of, was shoulder to shoulder with the bricklayers and the plasterers and the building trades. And he can relate to them. And he has very, I don't want to sound like an old dowager here, but very common tastes himself in the sense of popular taste. You know, he's a true sports fan and this kind of thing. He actually likes watching the World Wrestling Federation. Well,
that's a point I wish you didn't bring up. I was with you right until then.
but so he does relate to these people. It is genuine. He's not just a billionaire playing a trick on them and pretending to be one of them. And he certainly is not a sort of benign aristocrat like Franklin D. Roosevelt, who made no pretense to being one of the people, and his cigarette holder and his pince-nez, and spoke in that mellifluous Harvard, rich New York, Upper Hudson accent. You know, I mean, Trump has an outer borough, Queens, but educated accent. He's a well-educated man, Fordham and Wharton, and he's of course a rich man, but he does identify with the average person. That is sincere, and they do detect that, and you can see it in the popularity he has. I mean, as of now, he's leading DeSantis by over 30 points for the Republican nomination. He's leading Biden by 6 to 8 points in a presidential runoff in the polls.
Let's try a hypothetical. I think this whole nonsense, this legal stuff, is enhancing his position within the Republican Party. I don't think there's any doubt he's going to get the nomination. But can he win a general election? Because I can't see Biden's running again. I mean, try this for a second. This is just a theoretical thing. What if the Democrats, somehow or other, normalcy prevails there, and they pick a guy like, say, Robert Kennedy Jr., who's out of the mainstream? He would be semi-normal, semi-presentable, and I think would fare well against Trump. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but what do you think of that scenario?
Look, I can hardly believe that Biden would even want to run again. I mean, I'm all for, I have a slight, I'm in the party and interest here a bit, but I'm all for having older guys last longer in big jobs.
I'm with you on that one.
but you know, there's a young 82 and an old 82. I guess he's 80 now, but at the end of a second term, he'd be 86. And you know, Mr. Gladstone served as prime minister till I think he was 85, and Chancellor Adenauer was 88, I think. I mean, it can be done, and you know. Look, if you want to go to obscure people, the Doge Daldona conquered Constantinople at the age of 96. I mean, you know, strange things happen. I didn't know that. But I only know it because I read the Gaulle read that.
What do you think about a candidate substituting a Kennedy?
But my point is, you know, with Biden, you know, he hasn't done a good job. He's not well. He's clearly declining. But the fact is, historically, no one in either party who was elected president, I don't mean became president because the president died, he was elected president, and if he wanted to be renominated, he has always been renominated. It's almost impossible to knock them out. Now, if Biden actually thinks that he can win again and is doing a competent job, I don't see that you stop him. But to deal with your question, Tom, if he wasn't the candidate, whoever the Democratic nominee would be relevant. I don't think Kennedy is the guy. I mean, he's a strange cat, you know, and he's out there. I happen to agree with his complaints about COVID and Fauci, but he's a kind of a left-wing maverick, you know. I don't think that he's the one. In
conservative terms, not in Democratic terms. They see him as a right-wing maverick.
I think they'd get someone like Sherrod Brown or, you know, Bennett, the senator in Colorado, or Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, something like that. But who would not have Biden's own problems, but they will have to carry the can for this administration, and they would be quite unknown. I mean, there is something to Trump's theory. I mean, Trump's had two real strokes of genius. One was the translation of celebrity into the highest office, and the other was to wrench the Republican Party out of the proverbial country clubs and set it right on top of the disadvantaged areas.
Yep.
And use the tax system, good old Republican capitalism, Eisenhower capitalism, to redirect money into the disadvantaged areas and vacuum up for the Republican Party the Hispanic and African American votes. And he has changed that party.
Yeah. Let's switch topics for a bit. I liked your comment on the weekend because I get so much negative stuff on everything. And everybody talks about the decline of America and the ascendancy of China, the getting off the dollarization. But you had an interesting comment in your column this weekend. You didn't see it as a permanent decline of America. You really saw it as a sort of a plateauing of some kind, that there is hope. Because America has always been able to renew itself. If democracy works, it can renew itself. So you never discount America. But talk to me about that a little bit vis-a-vis China.
Look, I think the United States is an incomparably stronger country than China. China it's the greatest development story in the history of the world. It's an extraordinary success story in that way. But let's remember, it's still at least 50% a command economy. 40% of the population lives in very primitive conditions. I mean, if there is a group of African Americans and others trailing American prosperity, we're talking about 10 or 15% of people, not of certain groups of people, not even of the whole population. Here you have 500 to 600 million Chinese living pretty much as they did hundreds of years ago. And of course, it's not a system where they have any voice at all, but they are there. And it is something that China as an entity has to deal with. There is, with the possible exception of the army, no institution in China that is respected. And you can't believe anything the Chinese government says or any figure it publishes. And that's why it's not really in these monetary and currency organizations, because they won't play by those rules. And it is a totalitarian state. Now, and it has almost no natural resources. So what it has is a huge population and the self-confidence. I mean, they're 95% Han Chinese. It's very well integrated, and they have the self-confidence of an ancient and great and very numerous nationality, and so they should. But it doesn't have a system of government or economics that works or is any more than imitation. And they don't have a history of, and there'll be many in the room who know more about this than I do, but they don't have a history of innovation. They're pretty good at espionage. I mean, they completely undid Northern Telecom. They stole everything, and that's what Huawei was built on.
That's how it came to be.
I want to be clear. I'm very respectful of them as a nationality, but they're not supermen. They're not 10 feet tall, and they don't have a long track record of being a real contender in the sense that the greatest power in the world has to have institutions that work, a highly industrious population, and a history of, as you said, of political regeneration and of innovation in all sectors. I mean, the Chinese haven't invented much. It's a wonderful story of economic development, but it's not particularly impressive otherwise. And the United States does possess the genius of renewal. And I am confident it will do it again. But that's why this coming period is so important. I mean, where you have one candidate where, as we all know, the Russia-Trump collusion thing was a fraud, and it was known to be a fraud by the director of the FBI and the directors of Central and National Intelligence and those who signed the false affidavits authorizing telephone intercepts on the campaign and then the transition team of the president-elect. I mean, these are absolutely outrageous things. There was no legal sanction for it. And at the same time, and I'm no Clinton basher, but at the same time, Hillary Clinton destroyed 33,000 emails that were under subpoena. Nothing happened. I mean, the U.S., if it wants to be taken seriously, even by itself, as a constitutional democracy, it's going to have to clean this up a bit. I mean, equal legal treatment for both sides. And one of Jefferson's greatest achievements was setting up the military academy at West Point to have a non-political officer corps. That's worked. But we don't have that in the intelligence service and the FBI. People can say what they will about J. Edgar Hoover, who directed it for 48 years, but he never intervened in a presidential election.
Well, it is lopsided. The U.S. judicial, even as an outsider looking at it, it seems to be one-sided, that a lot of people get away with stuff where other people don't seem to get away with very much. Let's move from the U.S. to, say, a more depressed. By the way, Huawei didn't steal it. We sold it to them. We just sold them the Nortel stuff. And I don't think there was the check and balances at the governmental level we should have had to see what are we giving away here. That's my take on it.
Well, Peter McKay told me that when they, after Northern Telecom went down, the Defense Department took over their headquarters in Ottawa. And he said that everything, it was absolutely full of bugs and, intelligence surveillance. Mm-hmm. And it was all Chinese. So I assumed that they didn't pay us for all of it.
Well, they paid for the part they didn't bug. I mean,
okay.
The fair is fair.
Look, I'm not, I'm not a hyper moralist. If you can do it, I suppose it's not so bad. But my point is that was what they did. It wasn't Chinese inventiveness. It
No,
was
I agree.
Skill at espionage.
I agree, but also skill at buying up the dregs.
Yeah.
Let's take a more depressing turn here and talk about Canada a tiny bit. I mean, you nailed it in my mind at any rate. The focus on optics of buying votes with our money to everybody's aggrieved at something, but there's not a policy of building Canada, building manufacturing base. I mean, our investment category is primarily housing, which is essentially non-productive. Mm-hmm. Once you buy a house, you own a house, and okay, you got to pay the gardener or whatever, or do your own gardening. But this is not economic growth. It's good. It looks like investment, but it's not. And that does concern me because industrial policy is critically important. When you and I were growing up, if you got something from Japan, it was considered junk. And if you got something from England, that was quality. And now it's exactly the opposite because of a lack of policy or lack of focus or encouragement. And governments don't create growth. They create the circumstances for other people to grow an economy. We're not doing that. And I mean, where does this change? You got this lock with the NDP supporting the Liberal, and I don't want to say too much about our Prime Minister because I can't think of anything good. But give me your take on Canada. Where are we going? What's going to happen here? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I agree completely. And, I think there's a room for the government in the private sector, but in a cooperative way, and particularly in large projects like Trans-Canada Pipelines or something like that, where they can assist in an authentic, grandiose private sector vision and make it happen. The principal case in our
Trans Mountain
history
Pipeline
being
is
the
a
CPR.
disaster.
Sorry?
Trans Mountain Pipeline is a total, complete disaster.
Yeah, but that's for esoteric reasons. It's not because it isn't a good pipeline.
Oh, it's the right thing to do, but now it's about 8 times its original cost because of
But I couldn't agree more with you though, Tom. I mean, we like many Western societies, we've spent, and it's a great irony that it's happened this way, more and more and more on education, as we all know as parents and grandparents, to get less and less well-educated graduates. We set up universities in every town in the country and created this immense unemployment deferral scheme where stupefying numbers of
I love that phrase. I'm going to use that.
but we graduate huge numbers of people in disciplines that they cannot possibly make a living from. I mean, you can't go out into the world saying I'm a Bachelor of Arts in Gender Studies. I mean, get a job. You can't do that. I mean, it doesn't qualify you to do anything. And I think we sort of succumbed to a kind of snobbery that we had outgrown our position as a nationality of hewers of wood and drawers of water. And we were talented enough to be a service economy. But most of that isn't actually, in your words, productive work. I mean, you're right, house building, at least it backs into building materials and creates, construction jobs. But frankly, most, and I'm a non-practicing lawyer, but most lawyers don't add value to anything. I mean, an inordinate number of our employed people don't add value and are being carried by the ones who do. And in addition, as you say, we have tax policies and policies towards specific industries, especially our resource industries, that don't maximize the potential inflow of capital. I mean, at our table, I was speaking with Angela and Chris about once upon a time, I was the largest shareholder of Noranda Mines, but they were in base metals, precious metals, oil and gas, and forest products. And it never happened that they were all clicking at once. 2 were up and 2 were down, or 1 and 3 or something. But that was before China and India, representing almost half the population of the world, about 40%, I guess, became addicted to economic growth, at which point the demand for everything we have in this country went through the roof, and we are not taking advantage of it. It's a terrible irony.
15 years to bring them. You and I decide to bring a mine on stream. 15 years.
Yeah.
Or if you have to make a road to the Ring of Fire, 15 years to get approval for the road, never mind the mine kind of thing.
Well, and that's partly native issues too.
Absolutely. I will say, though, I graduated in economics and philosophy, which makes me functionally useless in the real world, so I literally had to go into the investment industry. It was the only career choice. What do you think's going to happen? What do you think's going to happen with this government situation? Are we going to have to sweat it out for the next couple of years with this unholy alliance between the NDP and the Liberals, or?
Yeah, look, by the way, about Justin, I would say this, because I knew his father fairly well. I've known him since he was very little, and he is, in fact, a very nice man. I have to say, he's a very nice man. Now, most politicians are, otherwise they're in the wrong business, but he is, and I would also say he's a pretty astute political leader. I mean, he's the only person in our history who went from third position, not even the official opposition, straight into a majority in government. He's the only one who's done that, and he doesn't seem terribly intelligent, but he's a very astute judge of how to position himself politically. Now, I think the image making that he engages in is frankly rather repellent to me. I could never stand the Kielburgers, and the whole we thing I thought was toe-curlingly awful. It was just a kind of boosterism of the kind that H.L. Mencken used to mock, the bourgeoisie. But I'm not your average voter, and it worked. So I think we have to give him credit for winning 3 straight elections.
Yeah, but still, it's something that we mentioned about repellent. Every time you see him on television, he's got his shirt undone, his sleeves rolled up. I'm a working guy. I mean,
that's a good one.
Please, he's never had a job in his other than the drama thing. Which
his father wasn't exactly a martyr to the work ethic either. I mean, nobody's, except for when Pierre was the prime minister, nobody's done any work in that family since old Arthur, if that was his name, founded that amusement park and the gas stations.
Yes, yeah, the True to Oil.
Yeah, but he made a lot of money for them. But I think we're probably stuck with them for 2 more years because I don't think they can pull the stunt of a short-term election again. They had the lame excuse of COVID, and it astounded me that the country re-elected a government that I thought had made a horrible mess of the whole COVID thing and signed us on to a Chinese vaccine that didn't work and so on. I mean, I thought it would have been an easy election for the Conservatives to win, and O'Toole managed to lose it. And but as I said, I think the tide will change. But I think we're probably stuck with them for 2 years. But look, I would be the last person the leaders of the Liberal Party would consult, so I don't know anything about it.
Yeah. We got this mess going on in the Ukraine, and I was thinking about. I was mentioning this morning at our meeting. I was thinking about World War I. Again, you're a student of history. You had all these alliances connected, and somebody takes a wrong turn in Sarajevo, and the Archduke and his wife get killed, and all these alliances click in, and everybody goes to war. That 20, 30 million, whatever the number is. And yeah, I notice Finland, for example, is part of NATO. If Russia invades Finland, I can't see Canada going to war over that. I just can't. We got to go defend. I just can't see it happen. Well, we can't do it anyway because our armed forces are nowhere near strong enough. But my point is, I worry about all these alliances coming out of this Ukraine thing, that we could have a spark that could fire through and ignite all these alliances.
I think it's an overdone comparison, Tom. I'll tell you why. In 1914, although they should have had a clue from the U.S. Civil War, where 750,000 people died in what was a civil war, and a population of 31 million Americans, they should have had an idea of what machine guns and heavy artillery and trench war can do. But they didn't, or almost none of them did. But there were alliances in place, and the key was when the German emperor gave the Austro-Hungarian emperor a blank check, in his own phrase, to do whatever he wanted to Serbia. That brought Russia in, and it all came after that. And it was aggravated when the Germans invaded Belgium. If he hadn't done that, he might have been able to avoid war with England. But here, we don't really have the great powers involved. It was a unilateral move by Russia. Ukraine has no allies bound to go to war for them. Russia has no allies bound to go to war for them. Putin's invocation of the possible use of nuclear weapons was just blank frustration at the fact that his army, contrary to what he had believed, didn't just roll over Ukraine the way it rolled over Crimea in 2014. I mean, he was oblivious to the fact that NATO countries, including Canada, had trained up 500,000 Ukrainians. So they actually had a serious army. And as long as NATO is paying the bills for munitions and equipment, Russia's in the presence of a very serious military power that it is grossly, provoked by invading the country. And so I don't think anyone is anxious to get into the war, and it is quite clear, it seems to me, that Putin stated his terms. He wants a peace, but not a peace that completely humiliates Russia. And Zelensky still thinks that he has a chance to throw the Russians out. I don't think you can throw the Russians out. I think he can hold what he has and maybe gain a little bit. But it seems to me that everyone is still saying give war a chance, meaning the Russians won't leave and the Ukrainians won't stop fighting without the Russians leaving. But I think when we see how the so-called spring offensives that we're still waiting for, even though it's spring over there, what they do, I think something close to where the armies are at the end of that will be at first a kind of Korea-style ceasefire line. And then I think what you'll end up with is, excuse me, and you might have to wait for a new administration in Washington to have the diplomatic talent to do this, but you enable Putin to say, look, I got something out of this. We haven't come back with our tails between our legs. We added to our territory. And the Russian speakers in Ukraine are now reunited with the motherland and this sort of thing.
I could see them. I don't think the Russians are going to give up the Crimea, though, ever.
No, I agree with you. And look, it was Russian anyway prior to 1954.
Absolutely.
I mean, Khrushchev just gave it to them because he was a Ukrainian. But so I think you'll end up with Russia having a peace that doesn't completely humiliate Putin, but Ukraine is established unequivocally as a sovereign country. And there's a massive rebuild job the world will help finance. And they can come into the EU when they meet the standards of honesty in government and join the West. And I think the biggest goal of the West in this war, apart from preventing freedom from just being steamrollered in Ukraine, and Russia rolling back the largest single part of their complete defeat in the Cold War, where the USSR disintegrated, as we were saying at our table, the greatest strategic victory in the history of the world for the West, without a shot being fired, is that we want Russia in the Western world too, and we want Russia to be friendlier with us than with China, and we can't do it while this war is going on.
Absolutely.
But as a fact, Russia, though most of the territories in Asia, most of the population is European, and it is much more a Western-facing than a Far Eastern-facing country, and we want them in the long term with us. Absolutely. And the way to do it is not to rub the Kremlin's nose in the muck, even though they deserve it.
Well, I think what we're going to see there is my 2 cents with is we're going to have a bloodletting again, and everybody's going to slug it out until they're just tired and then negotiate it, which will cost the Ukrainians territory.
Yeah.
Now let me, Liz, you were giving me hand signals. Where's Liz? I forgot what the signals were.
12 minutes left.
12 minutes. Now, is that for us to talk or open up to questions?
Nope. 12 minutes, open up the questions. Keep talking.
12. I don't know 12 minutes more of anything. Conrad doesn't know a lot of it. So we talked about China. We talked about Ukraine. We talked about Canada. You know, it's interesting. One of the things I was thinking about is you got all this stuff going on in the States, all this division, and it seems to be a lot of turmoil. Are we over-newsed, if I could use that phrase? We seem to be,
You mean the 24/7 news cycle?
Yeah, well, Walter Cronkite had a great line when he heard they were going to 24-hour news. He said, they're going to have to create a lot of news.
Yeah.
And we have got a lot of news. I look at the Business Channel, and the Business Channel says the market is up more today than it has been since, I'm just making this fictitious, than April 7th, 2003. And this is a Business Channel. How do I make a decision off that? It's like baseball scores that I'm getting all day. They're creating this stuff. But turmoil, shootings. Everything gets analyzed from. I remember when Trump said I might run for a third term. Remember they had the analysts on television analyzing, discussing this. How can he do this? The Constitution. Tell me about.
It's filler. I mean, you probably have been called into these things at times where they get so desperate they invite people like you and me to come on and comment on things that people have already been talking about for the last.
Yeah, but I just keep talking till I think of something.
Yeah, well, that's right. They're on air, so I can't. You remember when Pierre Trudeau he got so angry at the CBC, he threatened to shut it down, and as he put it, put on pictures of Japanese and Chinese vases. That was his image. It was kind of a funny image, you know. He's looking at vases.
I watch postcards from Canada. Did you ever see that thing, postcards from Canada?
Sure, the Rockies and the St. Lawrence and stuff. Yeah. Well, that's what they would rather do. You know these people are desperately anxious to think of something original to say. And of course, you're right. I mean, a 24-hour news cycle, I guess, meets the convenience of people who are up at odd hours and want to see the news. But there isn't enough news to fill it unless you're prepared, which there's no budget for, to send film crews around just doing casual studies of almost everything. One day in the life of everybody, you know. And they've committed themselves to more airtime than they can fill. They'd be better off, I think, to go to the old formula, putting on old movies and stuff like that.
Absolutely. I like watching that. Do you remember those travelogues they used to have? Foster, I think.
They're back now.
Yeah, I know. I'm watching that on television. 1950s travel to see what cities looked like in the 50s. So they're filling the channels with this stuff.
And that sort of boosterish voice that.
Yes,
you know. But it was time to say farewell.
I love those. I love those things. But media does over. That's 5 minutes. Am I correct? I get these.
No, but reruns of Johnny Carson or something. Okay, remember the Honeymooners? Remember that?
Yeah,
Jackie
absolutely.
Gleason.
Sure. Wait a sec.
Just it's not on? It's on. The Parliamentary Budget Office said in 2022 our budget financing is going to be 24 billion, and in 4 years it's going to go to 46 billion. Nobody cares. But what's happened is and I read all, just like you, I read the Post and the Globe and a lot of magazines and everything else in Canada, and the experience of the journalists are very weak. You come from a journalism background as well, and they don't report enough or educate enough on the cost of this. Mm-hmm. And if you go to, I'm not, Ryerson, but Ryerson's one of the big journalism schools, but some others. But I think there's a very huge, woke, cancel, you have to, they don't talk enough about financial and what's really going on and how we can become better and call the government out enough on what's going on.
Couldn't agree with you more.
I'm not talking about just Ottawa, I'm talking about Queen's Park as well.
Well, government everywhere. Now, look, this is a country which, as we all remember, but we have to pinch ourselves to remember that we had 14 consecutive balanced federal budgets, both parties. And we were, as a country, quite proud of it. And that's one of the reasons that we came through the 2008-09 crisis better than almost any other major country. And then Justin was elected. He said the deficit takes care of itself. He said we'll go a bit into deficit. And if you recall, Mulcair, the NDP leader, said no, we will not have a deficit. Even the NDP was saying that. Now it's all changed, and in all of our Western countries, no one seems to care about the deficit. So we are either waiting for the consequences of unlimited deficit financing, which is really a prodigious reduction of the value of all of our currencies. I mean, they're now not measured against anything except each other, and the inflation metric that's used, the consumer price index, is a fraud. They leave out housing, they leave out food prices for the most part. I mean, it's really not that representative of the facts. And all our currencies are like a bunch of mountain climbers tied together, where one falls down and then the others are pulled down a bit, then that one's stabilized, then the others, but they're all coming down in value all the time. If you read the works of Dr. Johnson and Dickens, 100 years apart, the price of everything in Britain was the same. It didn't change in 100 years. Now, they had terrible depressions at times, economic depressions, but there was no inflation. After World War I, and particularly with the stock market crash in '29 and the Depression, all of the countries gave up any standard of discipline on their currency, any yardstick that they would adhere to, and all of the currencies started to inflate rather than endure terrible economic depressions. And where all this is going to end up, it's hard to tell, but it's a very gradual process. But now we appear essentially to have given up. Now, we'll see if they can make any kind of a stand in the U.S. In the current round of lifting the deficit ceiling. Obviously, the United States can't default. But look, I put it to all of you that this whole business of qualitative easing was essentially a Ponzi scheme, and if you did it in the private sector, you'd get a sharply formulated letter from, the Crown prosecutor.
I think the basic thing in the investment industry, there is only one constant in our industry, and that's inflation.
Yeah.
It will be there forever. And even when it was 2%, it was never 2%. But just to touch your point, I don't think we have journalism anymore. I don't think it exists anymore. And the second part of your question is that I don't think people care. I don't think they care.
May I make 2 points on that?
No.
Well, on the journalism question, I think there are a few good, solid professional journalists.
There are a few, yes.
Well, I share that view, but she writes more for the London Daily Mail now. But I think people do care in this sense. All the polls show that the number of people who believe what is in the media it's down to 15% in the U.S. and it's a bit higher than that in Canada. But that shows that they quite rightly don't trust a free press. You can't have a democracy without a free press, but if the people don't trust it, they don't care about it. And so we won't have a free press, and then you won't ultimately have a democracy. I mean, I know that sounds kind of programmatic,
it's valid.
But it is a dangerous situation. We have to have some faith in our media, but they have to earn it, and they're not earning it. I agree with that.
That's the point.
I mean, I've employed thousands of journalists in different places, and we, if I may say it, ran quality papers, but most of them, are not qualified for what they do. They need a lot of supervision from the editors, and if you don't enforce a demarcation between opinion and comment, all you'll get is opinion, and that's where we are now. It's just the opinions of journalists who aren't qualified to advise us, with very few exceptions.
Are there any other questions out there? Yes, sir.
First off, Lord Black, thank you for taking the fall with your own profession and the value of lawyers, although it's made my table a little awkward. Yeah. I do appreciate your laying off stockbrokers, because that would have made this whole room quite awkward. I don't have a question. I guess it's a request. Can we have some happy news? What are you most positive about? What's you most enthusiastic about? What do you see as the most likely positive outcome for this country, for the Americans, for the Western world? Can we have some good news, sir?
Yeah, Brendan, as a matter of fact, I can. I am an optimist. I think that, as I said to you, I think Trump and Poilievre are likely to win, and I think they'll do well. I think Trump is a good president. I mean, unfortunately, casting studios don't send over the president, and we wished that he looked more like, FDR or JFK or Reagan or something, but he was a good president. I think he'll be back and do well, shape things up. There'll be no talk whatsoever of China becoming the leading power in the world when he's there. All the talk of China surpassing the U.S. economically ended about a week after Trump was inaugurated before. And I think Poilievre will shape this country up. I think in 1 year of him in office, you'll have the incentivization of our resource industries. You'll have the end of the war on the oil and gas industry. You'll have foreign money pouring in here, and the whole country will be purring like tabbies. So yes, I'm an optimist. And look, on the economic side, one of the things I've advocated is Canada could be a hard currency country. We don't really have a hard currency country in the world. But the first country that actually attaches it isn't gold. There's just too big a world money supply to attach it to gold now. But I think it requires a mixed basket of certain things. But the first country that does that, the flow of money into it will be a tsunami of incoming capital, and so it's all to play for. And Brendan, ultimately, people are survivors, and ultimately, most people do the sensible thing, even if they start out doing things that don't work. They get there, and we'll get there, and this country will be fine. Now, with that said, if I can just add one last ingredient, this business in Quebec is, in terms of federalism, where they're effectively eliminating the English language. I mean, I don't see how, as a country, we can tolerate the language of 75% of the people, as between the two official languages, being effectively exterminated. To use the parlance of our dear friends in office in Ottawa, the cultural genocide that our ancestors never attempted on the natives, his kinsmen are attempting, our Prime Minister's kinsmen are attempting in Quebec on the chief language of this country, not to mention 95% of the continent north of the Mexican border. And I don't think that is tolerable in a serious country. Now, how that plays out gets complicated.
Thank you. Any else? Yes, sir, this gentleman here. Oh. Please wait for the microphone. Then there's another fellow at the back there as well. So we do.
Conrad, two quick questions. Is Scholars and Sense coming back?
I'm sorry?
Your podcast with Victor
Davis Hanson? I had one on Friday.
Okay, great.
It's unfortunately what happened. That's with Bill Bennett and Victor Davis Hanson. And Bill assured us that he had a tax status, which you need in the U.S. to make these things work, but he didn't have it. And so we don't really have the budget to do it more than once a month right now, but we do that, and we'll ramp it up. But yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And your thoughts on the UK?
On the UK? I'm afraid it's hard to be optimistic there. I think Sunak is I don't know him at all, so I can't. He has the distinction of, that's what it is, of being the first British Prime Minister I haven't known since, my goodness, Anthony Eden. But he's a capable man, but I'm not sure if he has grasped that to be re-elected, the Conservatives have to reduce taxes. And to reduce taxes, because the British have a much more hair-shirted view of how budgets work, he has to reduce spending, and he hasn't shown that he grasps that. The budget that Truss was thrown out on, and Kwarteng, her chancellor, was a brilliant budget. They just didn't sell it right. But if he can, I think he's got a year and a half. If he can, towards the end, bring in a tax cut and assure people that it won't increase the deficit and be believed in that, I think he's got a shot, because the Labour Party this is the misfortune of the whole thing. The Conservative Party has basically gone back to being a pre-Thatcher party, a red Tory party. It's not really a Conservative party. Now, Boris is a Conservative, but he didn't really govern as one. And Sunak, it's a wait and see. We don't know. But when he was Chancellor, there was no sign that he was. And the Labour Party has gone back to the pre-John Smith, Tony Blair Labour Party of the far left, Jeremy Corbyn's party. And it's a terrible thing. After all Margaret Thatcher did, and up to a degree John Major following her, Britain is in danger of flopping back to that condition. But
Britain has been trying to commit suicide since I've been in the investment industry, and they're succeeding.
And she just held it up for 50 years.
She held it up for a while. But we have a gentleman at the back there.
Lord Black, thanks. This has been amazing today, and long-time listener, first-time caller, I guess. I want to tie a few things together in my question here, and that is that I guess demographically, from what I understand, China really has already hit kind of their apex, and their demographics will pull back quite a bit. Same with Russia, but at the same time, we see a lot of angst in the media about Taiwan and the future of Taiwan and China attacking Taiwan. We see a lot of angst in Europe about Russia. And my question would be, with your insight, how much of this do you believe is the media hyping this, or I guess the military and industrial complex in the U.S., kind of is the media feeding that with the forces at play, or are these real, in your mind, are these real threats to world stability, or is it mostly being ginned up by, we'll tune into CNN and we'll watch this? Like, how much of this is a real threat in the world, and how much of it really is being ginned up in your mind?
I don't think it is as big a threat as is stated. I'll tell you why. To invade Taiwan, they would have to have at least 500,000 men. They have to get them across 140 miles of blue water. That's 3 times farther than the Allies had to get to Normandy when Eisenhower had absolute control of sea and air, which the Chinese would not have. They'd be extremely contested in the air and on the water. And the landing craft, the vessels that convey the soldiers across would only move at about 12 or 15 knots. There's no sign at this point that they have such a fleet. So I don't, and there are only, as I understand it, 6 beaches on the China side of Taiwan, on the Formosa Strait side, where they could land, and they are very heavily defended. And one thing that I will say for President Biden, and as you may gather, I'm not his most fervent admirer, but I've got to say this for him. In the Defense Authorization Act, he did say that if Taiwan is invaded, the United States will come directly to its defense. I think the Chinese would be absolutely insane to try that. And the fact is, I speak to Henry Kissinger quite often, and he and Mr. Nixon agreed, well, Nixon first, with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, but it was repeated subsequently with Zhou Enlai and other Chinese governments, that, as Mao said, China will not focus on Taiwan for 100 years. So let's just leave it. We won't try and force reunification if you accept the principle that ultimately it's one China, and that's how it's been. And if you just stop talking about it, the Chinese won't do anything. So I think it'll settle down. Now, with that said, I think the alarm is not, to be fair, as far as I can see, the military-industrial complex, which wants to sell a lot of hardware to the U.S. government, but it doesn't want a war. And I don't think it's the media deliberately hyping it. I think it's just these signs of China becoming more active, and the shambles in Afghanistan, and just the appearance of the American weakness and so on. Relative weakness. It doesn't look like a weak country, but it's certainly been relatively incoherent by Cold War standards when it had the containment policy that it stuck to. It sort of lodges in the minds of uninformed people that the Chinese might actually try and take over Taiwan. But they would take a terrible risk, and they would probably fail. And I think if the Americans just stop sending high-level delegations there and let it settle down, I think it'll just go to sleep again as an issue. I don't mean the parties will, but the issue will.
Now we'll take one more question. Okay, no more question. Was that a hand raise, or you just bought the dish here? Well, okay, this gentleman right here, that's the last question.
Thank you. Can you elaborate on this? I think, looking from sort of a Western-centric view, the hegemony of the U.S. continues, and the things that the U.S. does around the world, is done for the good. And of course, if you look at Russian point of view, or Middle Eastern point of view, or Pan-Asian point of view, the U.S. has created numerous casualties, numerous wars, numerous hardships, and it's perhaps run by the military-industrial complex. Can you comment on that, and what's your view on that? I think it will just elaborate more on what you just started to say earlier.
Yeah, I have a more benign view of the United States than that. I mean, if I may say so, I think I have more reason than most people in this room to have some reservations about some of the things they do. I mean, they didn't treat me very well. But for a country of its power, I think it's behaved with great responsibility. I mean, those of us in Canada can attest to the fact of how much comparatively favored we are having them as a neighbor than, say, if we were in the position of Poland, between the Germans and the Russians. The result is Poland hasn't existed for most of the last 300 years as a country. And I think the Americans in general have only sought in the world not to be threatened. They let the Philippines go after they occupied it, after the war with Spain. And they let Cuba go right under their nose. Cuba would have been better off if the Americans had taken it under its wing like they did Puerto Rico. And they really don't want anything in the world other than they don't want anyone in the world to threaten them. And that's not unreasonable. Now, the fact is, you're quite right that in some of their foreign policy, they've entered into these distant places, smashed them up, and then lost patience with it and left. And that's, I think, the problem of these imbroglios in the Middle East recently. Throwing Iraq out of Kuwait was a crisp, surgical operation. They did it with allies. It was accomplished and they left. But the rest of it was insane. It wasn't well thought out. And George W. Bush had this idea that democracies don't go to war, so we'll just create democracies everywhere. And they just didn't think that if you gave lots of different jurisdictions the opportunity democratically to choose what they wanted, they would choose an undemocratic alternative. I mean, that happened in Algeria, for example, where they had free elections and the people elected a party advocating dictatorship. I mean, it does happen. It happened when they had that insane election that replaced the PLO with Hamas in Gaza. The Americans were responsible for that. So they do meddle in places in ways where their statesmen aren't qualified to judge what the local consequences will be. But in general, I think we have to give the Americans this. They have been a positive force in the world. They were ultimately the force that tipped the balance in World War I. President Roosevelt's achievement in doing the necessary to keep Britain and Canada in the war, and then his conduct of the war, was absolutely essential. And I'm now being signaled by Elizabeth the Great, the Magnificent, the supreme authority in the room, to shut up, and I will, but I'll just make this point, that in the key moment of Western history in modern times, in 1940, Roosevelt, running for a third term, breaking a tradition as old as the Republic, gave the British 50 destroyers, instituted the first peacetime draft in history, extended territorial waters from 3 miles to 1,800 miles, ordered the U.S. Navy to attack on detection any German ship, and then passed the Lend-Lease Act, giving Britain and Canada anything they wanted and they could pay for it whenever they could. That was his definition of neutrality. If he hadn't done that, the democracies could not have continued in the war. We must not forget what the United States has done for the world, and we mustn't be altogether disillusioned by relatively minor mistakes like Afghanistan. I mean, it's a tragedy, but it doesn't compare to the positive benefit of America's force for democratic government in the world.
Conrad, thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed this. We should sit around.
So have I.